Race realism is the position that race is a biological reality, not a social construct. The foundation of race realism is not ideology nor even science, but direct observation. Long before they acquire language, children perceive racial differences without being instructed to do so. As they mature, children begin to associate these physical differences with behavioral patterns. We observe racial differences prior to language, prior to politics, prior to ideology, and prior to science. Science does not generate but confirms what observation already tells us. Disciplines like genetics, cranial morphometry, endocrinology, and psychometrics confirm that our intuitive distinctions track biologically meaningful patterns. Race realism, therefore, is not a hypothesis awaiting proof, but an empirical generalization resisting disproof. The social construct thesis, by contrast, fails the test of empirical adequacy as it denies that which is directly observed and statistically consistent. A social construct is a collectively maintained category or thing that is made real by convention or collective agreement. Examples include money, a symbolic medium of exchange that holds value only because institutions enforce and individuals accept its worth, and traffic rules, which are arbitrary coordination systems, like driving on the right or the left side of the road. Race is not like these. Race is a biological reality that arose from evolutionary pressures long before human societies, languages, or institutional conventions existed. In fact, rather than race being a social construct, it is far more accurate to say that society is a product of race. To say race is a social construct is to invert cause and effect, like saying clay is a sculpture. Races are different because they evolved by divergent evolutionary paths. These involved lengthy geographic isolation, different environmental selection pressures, and differential social and sexual selection. We observe racial differences across several domains, including morphological differences in cranial shape and volume, skin pigmentation, facial features, and hair texture and density, cognitive differences in general intelligence, working memory, neural connectivity patterns, time preference, and moral intuitions, and behavioral differences in aggression and impulsivity, conscientiousness, parental investment and nurturing, truthfulness, inventiveness, and cooperation. Many people assume interracial differences are due primarily to differences in culture, but culture is not so much the origin of difference as an outcome. Specifically, culture reflects 1. The policies of a society's elites, and 2. The underlying biological traits of the population. In this sense, culture is an extended phenotype. So let's clarify the causal sequence. First, ecological selection pressures shaped population-specific gene pools. Genes influence developmental trajectory, including the structure of the brain. Neural architecture shapes cognition and cognition and temperament shape behavior. Therefore, thought and behavior are largely constrained by biology. Of course, culture does exert a recursive influence, but all traits are influenced by genetics. A key variable here is neoteny, the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood, which reflects the pace of development and duration of brain plasticity. The longer the brain remains plastic, the more it can learn, plan, and coordinate with others. All races are neotenic relative to earlier hominins, but they differ significantly in degree. A group's level of neoteny reflects its life history strategy, which lies along the RK selection spectrum, a concept from evolutionary biology describing reproductive trade-offs between quantity and quality. In R-selected environments, typically unpredictable, high-risk, and high-mortality ecologies like sub-Saharan Africa, natural selection favors early maturity, high fertility, short-term planning, and low parental investment. These traits characterize a fast life history strategy and are associated with low neoteny. In contrast, K-selected environments, such as cold, resource-scarce, and stable regions like Ice Age Europe or Northeast Asia, favor delayed reproduction, fewer offspring, extended childhoods, high parental investment, and cooperative behavior. These reflect a slow life history strategy and correlate with high neoteny. Let's address 4 main objections. A common objection to race realism is that racial categories cannot be biologically real because they vary across cultures and historical periods. This reasoning assumes that for categories to be meaningful, they must be fixed, universal, and perfectly delineated. But this is a category error. Taxonomies are tools for tracking regularities, not Platonic ideals. For example, a person with a white mother and a black father is biologically 50% of each ancestry. Whether such a person is socially categorized as black, as in the United States, or mixed, as in Brazil, is culturally variable, but it does not alter the underlying biological facts. Another objection claims that because human traits vary along a continuum, racial categories lack biological validity. This reflects a misunderstanding of how biological classification operates. Continuous variation is the norm, not the exception, in evolutionary biology. Red and orange gradually blend into one another, yet both are distinct and meaningful categories. Likewise, the existence of racially mixed individuals does not disprove the existence of races any more than the color green disproves the existence of the colors blue and yellow. Yet another objection to race realism is that racial classification can be utilized to justify oppression of certain groups. However, this objection has nothing to do with the empirical validity of race and racial differences. Many true and useful distinctions, like sex, age, health, or income, can likewise be abused, but misuse does not invalidate biological or epistemological validity. A final objection holds that contemporary science has refuted the concept of race. Critics often demand either A, a single essential trait that all members of a race possess and others lack, or B, a single causal mechanism responsible for all intergroup differences. But taxonomy does not depend on essences, singular defining traits, or unitary causes. This is because evolution does not proceed by perfectly discrete jumps, producing sharp edges, but rather by shaping populations within adaptive fitness landscapes, often forming identifiable local optima, or islands of evolutionary stability, which are revealed by observable clusters of traits. Population genetics routinely identifies distinct ancestral clusters, and forensic scientists can determine race from skeletal remains, oral bacteria, or a strand of hair. Artificial intelligence is now capable of identifying people's race from chest x-rays, spine radiographs, and even mammograms. Race is an important factor in determining if donors of organs and bone marrow are potential matches for patients. According to leukemia charity Gift of Life, quote, "Ethnicity is the key to a perfect match between donor and recipient." So there is no problem of scientific evidence for race, but rather a problem with scientists and other intellectuals being too afraid to speak the truth. More importantly, though, race realism does not depend on science for its validity. People observed racial differences long before the emergence of biology or genetics. Any society premised on the denial of race will collapse from accumulated error, just as any bridge built on false measurements will collapse from accumulated strain. In the workforce, general intelligence is strongly predictive of job performance. Thus, when two groups with significantly different average IQs compete in the same job market, only two equilibrium states are possible. Either persistent exclusion and status frustration of the lower performing groups, or the meritocratic standards are compromised via affirmative action, penalizing the higher performing groups. Both of these scenarios foster resentment and conflict. The core principle here is that unequal groups cannot compete on equal footing. In education, race-blind policies routinely misfire because they are based on the foundational error of presuming all groups possess equivalent cognitive potential, and so treat unequal outcomes as signs of injustice, underfunding, or lack of effort, rather than evolved group differences. Take the U.S. federal initiative No Child Left Behind, designed to close the racial achievement gap in education. Billions of dollars were spent attempting to equalize test scores across racial groups, but instead of producing convergence, the initiative exposed the persistence of the gaps, incentivizing test manipulation, grade inflation, and lowered standards. Then we have legal consequences. In societies like Northern Europe, legal norms evolved under conditions of high neoteny peoples and demographic homogeneity, favoring leniency and minimal enforcement. But when these legal norms, calibrated for high-trust, high-neoteny demographics, are extended to low-neoteny groups who require much harsher punishments and tighter oversight, the result is, not surprisingly, an increase in crime and repeat offenders. Such societies are then forced to either punish the law law-abiding natives with over-regulation and over-enforcement, or to sacrifice justice for political optics so as not to appear racist. Judicial consequences. Multiracial societies totally destroy the function of the jury system, designed to ensure a defendant is judged by his own peers. Peers are those sharing norms and moral intuitions, but when jurors come from divergent racial, cultural, and behavioral profiles, they no longer interpret evidence through a common frame, but instead base deliberations on ethnic loyalty, narrative bias, and intergroup grievances. Moreover, due to pervasive anti-white propaganda, non-whites exhibit substantially greater in-group bias. For instance, black jurors have been shown to favor co-ethnics at rates about 15 times higher than white jurors who have been conditioned to suppress their own group loyalty. Social consequences. In high-trust, ethnically homogeneous societies, such as those historically found in Scandinavia or Japan, norms, cooperation, and reciprocal altruism flourish because group members share genetic similarity, culture, and moral intuitions shaped by their common ancestry. But when diverse groups with divergent time preferences, aggression thresholds, and group loyalty are integrated under the pretense of interchangeability, people become more guarded, they stop caring for the commons, and public spaces lose their safety and warmth. Then we have fertility consequences. Race denialism suppresses fertility among European-descended populations both by delegitimizing white pride and continuity as valid motives for reproduction, and also by sanctioning mass immigration into white countries, which further reduces the birth rate of the native populations. Political consequences. Ethnic groups differ in trait distributions, and so they naturally have different needs and express divergent preferences in government, institutions, traditions, and norms. Thus, democracy in a multiracial society degenerates into voting blocks aligning along ethnic and religious lines. Collective consequences. Race denialism obscures the reality that individuals do not just act in isolation, but as members of groups, with distinct and incompatible group evolutionary strategies. Race denial is not an honest mistake, but a deliberate political strategy. Only Europeans, white people, are told that their race is a social construct. Everyone else gets to retain a meaningful racial identity. The Black Lives Matter movement clearly affirms the salience of blackness. Mexicans are allowed to be proud of their racial heritage. Many Jews care deeply about the ethnic continuity and sacredness of Jewish identity, and so forth. This double standard exposes the fact that race denialism serves not a scientific, but a political function, specifically to delegitimize European civilizational dominance by portraying its success as the product of systemic injustice rather than evolutionary advantage. The displacement of race realism in academia and public discourse did not arise from new empirical discoveries, but from an ideological pivot initiated by the Jewish anthropologist Franz Boas. Boas rejected the then dominant hereditarian view of race, claiming that behavioral and cognitive differences were purely environmental. Boas's student, Margaret Mead, further entrenched this cultural determinist paradigm, and another student of Boas, Israel Ehrenberg, aka Ashley Montague, helped draft the 1950 UNESCO Statement on Race, which institutionalized the claim that race has no biological basis. Building on this framework, the Frankfurt School, comprised largely of Jewish Marxists such as Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Theodor Adorno, sought to pathologize European racial consciousness as inherently authoritarian. This ideological campaign expanded into the realm of biology and psychology through the work of Jewish evolutionary biologists Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, and their efforts were reinforced by the epistemological shift of postmodernism, especially by the Jewish philosopher Jacques Derrida, who rejected objective categorization altogether. In conclusion, race realism is not a speculative theory, but the empirical default position confirmed by the best available genetic, anthropological, and psychological evidence. Race is real, not a construct of society, and society is a construct by men, for their kin to preserve their kind. Pretending otherwise is socially deleterious, politically dangerous, and scientifically dishonest. We must always remember that, from an evolutionary perspective, loyalty to one's group and in-group preference is the rational strategy in the game of genetic and cultural survival. To treat all individuals and groups as interchangeable is merely to forfeit that game, surrendering one's future to others who continue to play. Race denialism thus disarms whites while empowering other groups to continue acting in their group's interests, creating a game-theoretical asymmetry that, if not corrected, will culminate in the genetic and cultural extinction of the European peoples.